There is a peculiar room inside each of us, shaped by memory and longing, lit by the dim glow of what we once expected from other people. Sometimes it hums with the echo of laughter we haven't heard in years. Sometimes it is a hollow that expands like the space under an abandoned bridge. Walk through a city at dusk and you will see the room from the outside. Commuters shoulder to shoulder on the train, faces bright with screen light, mouths quiet. Neighbors who pass each other on stairwells as if the facade of privacy were a firewall that keeps warmth out as well as strangers in. We have never been closer in distance, and yet, for many, the distance inside the chest has never been wider. Loneliness is not simply being alone. It is the pain that arrives when the human longing for meaningful connection, for being seen, acknowledged, understood, is frustrated. It is not an inconvenience. It is a signal, a kind of social pain that warns us that the network of our belonging has been frayed. Imagine hunger that speaks in moods instead of stomach cramps. A sudden sharpness when you realize nobody will tell you a story of your day. A dull ache when no one knows the shape of your small humiliations and your quiet joys. Loneliness can be quiet or dramatic, chronic or a passing storm. It arrives as shame, as irritation at others, as a craving for attention that leaves us with less of what we wanted when we get it. Why this ache now? In an age when information travels at the speed of light and friends are counted in hundreds, part of the answer lives in the mismatch between the human brain shaped across millennia for small-scale social living and our modern architecture of life. For most of human history, our close networks were small and stable. Family, a few allied families, neighbors whose faces you could map by the way the wind moved through the alley. Our social instincts expect reciprocity. Mutual recognition, repeated interaction, shared rituals. Today, our days are often organized around anonymous transactions, technologies that collapse intimacy into broadcast, and institutions that reward performance over presence. We outsource conversation to short texts and curate ourselves into highlight reels. The result is a world with more social signals and fewer social stitches. But the story of loneliness is not only about structures and screens. It is intimate and developmental. The first map we learn for how to ask for help, to trust, to soothe ourselves is drawn in infancy. The tone of those early exchanges, whether caregivers responded to our cries with steadiness or with inconsistency, whether touch meant safety or alarm, leaves patterns that recur as adults. Some learn to broadcast need with a roar, to cling to any sign of attention. Others learn to constrict, to map survival onto self-reliance, and to mistrust the hands offered. These attachment patterns are not moral failures. They are adaptive responses grown from the soil of experience. Yet they can become their own kind of prison. The anxious heart that pushes people away while pleading for closeness, the avoidant heart that builds walls and then mourns the emptiness behind them. There is a philosophical dimension too, older and more ancient than our technologies. The fact that each person is an island of subjectivity, aware of their own point of view in a way that cannot be fully transferred. We stand, inescapably, alone before existence, and we know it. Existentialist thinkers named this loneliness as part of the human condition. To be free is to be separated by freedom itself. But existential loneliness differs from social loneliness. It is the recognition that no one will ever feel your inner taste of grief in exactly the same way. That recognition can be terrifying, and it can also be liberating. The tension between the ache for shared feeling and the unbridgeable fact of inner life produces questions that are both philosophical and practical. How do I become known? How do I accept the solitude that comes with being human without surrendering the desire for real connection? Is loneliness a failing of the world or a kind of teacher? We ask curiosity questions because they are the small hinges on which imagination opens. What would happen if we treated loneliness like a weather report instead of a moral indictment, a condition to be read and prepared for rather than a permanent trait of the self? What would happen if, in our education systems, we taught listening as carefully as reading? If workplaces were judged partly on how they foster community rather than only on profits? How would the architecture of cities change if we prioritize thresholds and courtyards that invite people to encounter each other, rather than glass towers that isolate? None of these questions are decorative. They embed practical hints. To begin addressing loneliness, because this is a long conversation, We can start with a few psychological and philosophical approaches that are small, humane, and yet profound. First, name the feeling. The act of naming, "I feel lonely," is remarkably potent. Psychology calls this effect labeling. It is an early, simple intervention that creates distance between you and the storm of emotion, reducing shame and opening the space for choice. Shame says, "There is something wrong with you for feeling this." Naming says, "This is what I am feeling now." It allows curiosity in why now? What triggered this? What would help, even a little? Second, reframe loneliness as a signal, not a verdict. Philosophically, this is an invitation to agency. A fever tells us something is amiss. So does loneliness. It can be read as a call to change environments, to deepen a relationship, to repair an old wound, to open to vulnerability. When we stop treating it as permanent, we open realistic pathways for action. This reframing turns despair into a project. Not a simple project, but a human one, with fits and starts and learning. Third, practice microvulnerability. Intimacy is not a single grand event, but an accumulation of small disclosures. We are taught to believe that vulnerability is dangerous, that to show a crack in our armor is to invite attack. Yet, vulnerability is the raw material of connection. It is what tells another person, "I trust you enough to risk being less than perfect." You don't need to confess your deepest trauma to begin. You can offer small things: a brief admission of a hard day, an honest confession of joy, a question about someone's inner life. These are small invitations that, when reciprocated, knit threads between people. Fourth, cultivate rituals of presence. Humans are ritual animals. Shared rituals are the glue of communities. They synchronize bodies, create shared meaning, provide a biography to relationships. The ritual can be simple: a weekly walk with a neighbor, a short phone call to check in with an old friend, a shared meal where phones are left at the door. Rituals lower the friction of connection. They design meetings into the fabric of life so that belonging does not rely on perfect spontaneity. Fifth, build practice over preaching. Loneliness is not solved by clever insights alone. It is a behavioral problem as much as an emotional one. Start with small, doable acts that tilt you toward others. Offering to help in a community project, joining an activity that requires working with others, volunteering where you meet people around shared action. Shared goals create natural, deep ties because they shift the focus from self to something outside the self, and in doing so the self becomes visible and valued. Sixth, practice compassionate self-dialogue. Loneliness often arrives with a harsh inner voice. Who would want you? You're too much. You're not interesting. These are not truths. They are defensive stories, sometimes ancient. Replace condemnation with curiosity. Ask, what is this voice protecting me from? And what would a kinder friend say? The practice of self-compassion, championed by modern psychotherapy and older contemplative traditions, reduces the secondary suffering that loneliness creates, the shame on top of the pain, and makes it easier to risk connection. Seventh, seek structures that scaffold closeness. Relationships grow inside systems. Families, neighborhoods, clubs, workplaces. If your current systems are thin, you can invent new ones or redesign old ones. Think like a gardener. Plant small experiments, tend them, and be willing to pull what doesn't grow. This may mean setting up a monthly dinner group, starting a book club, inviting a coworker to share lunch, or joining a local choir. The key is repeated encounters with the same people around a shared focus. There are moral and political layers to this too. Isolation is not only personal failure, it is also sometimes a byproduct of policies and economies that prize mobility, consumption, and thin forms of engagement. There is a collective responsibility to imagine towns, schools, and workplaces that are structurally hospitable to human attachment. Yet even within the constraints of broader systems, we retain agency. Our small acts ripple. Finally, remember the paradox that makes loneliness also a possibility for depth. Solitude and connection are siblings. There is a kind of solitude that feeds creativity, reflection, and the inner life, a chosen silence that restores. Distinguish that solitude from the ache of unmet social needs. Learn to be in your own company with gentleness. That capacity reduces the desperation in your approach to others and allows you to enter relationships from a place of fullness rather than need. I do not offer these as easy cures. There are no cures, only practices, structures, and love. Loneliness is naughty because it gathers history, culture, biology, and meaning into one felt symptom. Yet it is navigable. The first part of the compass is clear. Notice the feeling without shame, name it, make small invitations toward other people, tend repeated encounters, practice self-compassion, and design rituals that invite mutual recognition. There is also another compass, quieter and philosophical. To embrace the fragile fact of our separateness while refusing to let it make us defenders of solitude. Both compasses together, the practical and the philosophical, can move us. As you close this first reflection, consider this. What small thing could you try this week to shorten the distance between you and another person? What single, tiny vulnerability might you risk? What ritual could you introduce that would make encounters inevitable rather than rare? The next parts of this narration will trace deeper into the wounds, the social architectures, the neurochemistry, the cultural stories, and the ways individuals and societies can heal and be healed. For now, hold the question like a coin in your palm. It is both a weight and a promise. You have felt it before. A room full of people where the noise becomes wallpaper and you inhabit a smaller, sharper bubble inside your own chest. The sound of laughter travels across the room like wind across glass, bright but distant, and for a moment you wonder whether everyone else learned a language you were never taught. It is a small, private dislocation. Not dramatic, not cinematic, but precise and insistent. This is the particular cruelty of contemporary loneliness. It does not always arrive as catastrophe. Often it arrives as texture, a slow abrasion that smooths away the edges of days until they feel interchangeable. There is a shape to the loneliness we live with now that deserves careful attention. It is braided from three threads that tug at each other. First, the inner script we inherit from our earliest attachments. Second, the cognitive habits that govern how we perceive social signals. And third, the social architecture that scaffolds or fails to scaffold repeated, meaningful encounters. These threads are not neat categories. They weave through each other so that the slightest tug on one sends a shiver through the rest. Think of a violin string whose vibration is altered by the weight of a pebble on the bridge, by how you hold the bow, by the wooden humidity in the room. Loneliness is like that, always musical, sometimes discordant. Consider the script. In infancy, we learn how to ask for help, how to read faces, how to expect reciprocity, and how to make peace with silence. If the adults around us responded with predictability, we learned trust. If they were erratic, we learned caution. If they were absent, we learned an economy of self-sufficiency. These early calibrations are not fate, but they are templates. As adults, we replay them without always knowing we are acting out a childhood defense. The anxious parts of us speak quickly and loudly. The avoidant parts grow silent and shrink. The wounded parts mistake proximity for danger. When these parts collide within one person, when the desire for connection is held in one hand while suspicion is clenched in the other, relationships become battlegrounds for old survival strategies. How many tender attempts at closeness have been misread as demands? How many small kindnesses have been anticipated as betrayals? The past is present in ways we rarely name. Then there is perception, the way our minds interpret the world. Humans are remarkably prediction machines. We anticipate how other people will respond, and we act accordingly. If you walk into a party expecting to be invisible, you will move in ways that make invisibility more likely. If you scroll through carefully curated streams of other people's joy and achievement, your brain samples from polished highlights and constructs a narrative. Everyone else is thriving, and you are an exception. Social media intensifies a natural human tendency. We compare impressions, not realities. Comparison, when unchecked, becomes a slow thief of belonging. It converts curiosity about others into measurement against an unspoken bar. The consequence is twofold. We feel inadequate and we close off, either by performing the persona we think will be accepted, or by withdrawing to avoid the risk of failing to measure up. The social architecture enfolds all of this. The structures that used to bind people, Stable neighborhoods, apprenticeships, multi-generational households have shifted. Mobility, specialization, the fragmentation of time, the elevation of productivity over presence. Each change has costs as well as benefits. There is dignity in autonomy, and there is value in privacy. Yet freedom without tether can leave people floating. When meeting another person becomes a scheduling problem rather than an organic continuation of life, relationships become fragile. This fragility is not a moral failing. It is structural. It asks for collective imagination. What would it look like to design cities, workplaces, and institutions that expect people to need each other? What would it look like to make ordinary days thick with low-stakes encounters that add up to belonging? If you listen closely to the voice of loneliness, you will hear not only complaint but instruction. It speaks in two tones. The first is a demand, "Be with me." The second is a diagnostic whisper. Something here needs mending. In that whisper, there is an opportunity. Loneliness can be monstrous. It can also be a tutor in attunement if we allow it to teach rather than shame us. The path from tasting loneliness to rebuilding connection is neither short nor linear. It is a patient apprenticeship in curiosity. Start with curiosity about the self. When that ache rises, what story does your mind tell? Is it a story of personal deficiency? I am unlovable? Or is it a story of context? This environment does not invite intimacy? Try to meet the feeling with a question rather than an accusation. Ask, "What is this feeling trying to tell me?" And then listen without rushing to action. The difference between shaming and questioning is seismic. Shame narrows the field of possible responses. Curiosity expands it. Then turn curiosity outward. The most underused social skill on the planet is the art of asking well. Not the performative, surface-level questions that elicit rehearsal. How have you been? Fine. But the kinds of questions that invite specificity and warmth. What was the most surprising part of your week? Who made you smile recently and why? These questions are cracks through which real human texture seeps. When you ask them, you offer someone the permission to be particular. People long to be remembered in their detail. There is also a practical ethic here. Reciprocity as practice. We often think reciprocity is about tit for tat, an exchange ledger where favors and confidences balance out. Real reciprocity is more generous. It is the willingness to be small acts of kindness without immediate accounting, trusting that networks of mutual aid grow over time. This is not magic. It is mathematics of a social kind. Repeated, small acts increase the probability of return. If you notice a neighbor's plant struggling and offer to water it, you are not only helping a plant, you are making a tiny bridge. Vulnerability is the currency of that bridge. It is misunderstood as a collapse. In truth, it is a skillful offering. You do not need to unload all your pain at once. Vulnerability begins in increments. A short admission of fatigue, a quick confession of a small fear, a surprising compliment that shows you noticed. Each of these is a hand extended. Some hands will be taken, some will not. That is part of the risk. But without risk, there is no repair. The balance is in learning to gauge where reciprocity is possible and when it is not, and in learning to carry rejection without turning it into a verdict on your worth. At the same time, do not mistake solitude for failure. There is a discipline in being alone that is not loneliness. Solitude, chosen and tended, becomes a workshop of the self. It is in solitude that we practice listening to our own voices, learning what we actually desire, separating hunger from appetite. The invitation is to cultivate a relationship with yourself that is tender and honest, so that when you enter relationships with others you bring fullness rather than neediness. This is not self-sufficiency as fortress building. It is self-possession as a capacity for giving. Practically speaking, the reparative work has rhythms. It requires attention to habits, the way you greet people, the rituals you keep, the questions you ask at the end of the day. It requires courage to show up even when previous attempts have failed. It requires the humility to be wrong about how others will respond. The good news is that these are teachable skills. Listening, asking good questions, offering small vulnerabilities, tending rituals, they can be learned. They respond to practice in the same way a muscle becomes stronger with repetition. there is a moral imagination to be exercised as well. What would it mean to view loneliness as a social problem rather than a personal flaw? Imagine workplaces that measure success partly by the quality of collegial bonds. Imagine schools that teach emotional literacy as rigorously as algebra. Imagine neighborhoods that prioritize thresholds and places for incidental encounters. These are not utopian fantasies. They are design questions. They ask us to treat belonging as an infrastructure to be built, maintained, and budgeted for. Finally, there is a tender, stubborn faith required. The belief that the world is not a zero-sum arena of warmth. In our loneliest moments, it is easy to believe love is scarce, that every offering of warmth diminishes the supply for ourselves. But most human warmth does not subtract. It multiplies. A small, sincere act of attention often returns more than what was given. The practice is to keep giving small attentions without expecting immediate reward, to accumulate a ledger of kindness whose interest pays out in unexpected ways. So ask yourself, in the quiet after reading this, what one small question could you ask someone tomorrow that would invite them to be particular? What tiny ritual could you plant in your week that would connect you to the same people repeatedly? What practice could you adopt that would help you listen before you judge, to offer vulnerability before you armor? These are not heroic prescriptions. They are the grain of habit that over years becomes habitus, the way you live in the world and the way the world learns to live with you. Loneliness is not a problem you will solve once and for all. It is a condition that will reappear with life's changes. With moves, losses, births, retirements, and the shifting tides of friendships. That is both the difficulty and the blessing. The difficulty is the recurring pain. The blessing is the repeated call to practice. Each return is an invitation to refine your answer. Over time, the cumulative effect of small attentions becomes a map. Not a guarantee against solitude, but a chart for navigating it with more grace. If there is a single sentiment to carry forward from this part, it is this: loneliness asks for two skills that are simple and demanding: curiosity and courage. Curiosity to know yourself and others with specificity. Courage to show a small piece of your interior in the hope that it will be received. Together, they make the quiet architecture of belonging. There are forms of loneliness that are loud and obvious. The empty bed, the phone that does not ring, and there are forms that move like a fog through the bones, subtle and persistent. Tonight's loneliness might be the sort that sits at the edge of a conversation, whispering that you are not interesting enough, not witty enough, not whole enough to be stayed with. Or it could be the loneliness that comes after a fight, when words have been said that cannot easily be unsaid, and the distance between two people feels like a canyon dug by impatience. There is a loneliness that blooms in success and in failure alike, in applause and in silence. It does not only live in the unaccompanied. It is a companion to shame, and that relationship is crucial to understand. Shame is the shadow of loneliness. Where loneliness says, "You are alone," shame says, "You are alone because you are flawed." These two voices conspire to keep us small. Shame narrows the world. It makes our stories about ourselves shorter and crueler. It tells us to hide the parts of our lives that might be judged. It teaches us the economy of perfection, that to be loved we must first appear lovable. And so we perform. We curate images, craft stories, time our disclosures, and measure our smiles. But performance is a kind of solitude. It fills the space with surface and polished surfaces do not encourage hands to rest there. They slide off. When we are constantly on display, we are not being known. What would it mean, then, to practice being known rather than performing? There is a small, paradoxical method at the heart of honest connection. Begin with humility. Humility here is not shame's cousin. It is a brave, clear-eyed recognition of finitude. It says, "I am not all of myself in this moment, and I might not be understood, but I am willing to risk being partial." Humility opens the possibility that someone else might respond in kind, not to fix you, but to meet you. This meeting does not guarantee romantic completion or lifelong friendship. It simply creates a cluster of moments where recognition can grow. Repair is another quiet art, the practice of returning after we have damaged a bridge. We imagine relationships as fragile glass, and sometimes they are. But repair is possible and often simpler than our fear makes it. A direct apology that names the harm and takes responsibility is a powerful instrument. It need not be ornate. A single clear sentence, "I'm sorry I spoke that way. I want to do better," can begin the work of mending. Alongside apology, there must be attentive listening. When someone is harmed, they need to be heard without immediate defense. The willingness to listen is a gift. It costs us humility and time, but it creates the conditions for trust to return. There is also potency in small, ordinary reciprocity. We valorize grand gestures. We overlook the daily ledger of little kindnesses. Bringing someone a cup of tea when they are exhausted, answering a text even when you're busy, showing up for the birthday call. These are the stitches that prevent the social fabric from unraveling. Consider the math of small acts. Repeated, modest attentions accumulate into a pattern that tells a nervous mind, "I am predictable. I can be relied upon." Predictability is the other half of intimacy. It does not feel glamorous, but it teaches the brain to relax. What about the politics of belonging? The ways in which identity and culture shape who gets invited into closeness and who is left outside. Loneliness is not distributed evenly. Marginalization, prejudice, and social stratification make belonging more fraught for some people. When communities are organized by exclusion as well as inclusion, loneliness is not only private sorrow, it is an outcome of power. The philosophical response to this is collective responsibility. That means imagining institutions and social practices that deliberately widen the circle. Schools that normalize emotional learning, employers who design work to include meaningful collaboration, neighborhoods that mix ages and incomes so that stories cross generational and economic divides. There is a moral imagination at work here. To believe that we can shape communities to be more hospitable is to commit to practices that carry costs but yield deeper payoffs in human flourishing. On the level of the individual mind, loneliness often locks into patterns of anticipation that become self-fulfilling prophecies. We predict rejection and then behave in ways that make rejection more likely. We cancel plans at the last minute, we keep conversation shallow, we withhold questions that might reveal vulnerability. Cognitive behavioral strategies help here. Test a prediction with an experiment of curiosity. If you suspect someone won't return your call them once and notice what happens. If you fear humiliation, offer a small, true self-disclosure and measure the response. You will often find the world is less hostile than your fear predicted. Each small experiment that disconfirms the worst forecast loosens the grip of anxious expectation. Yet not all loneliness can be eased by behavioral experiments. Some of it is grief. Loss of a person, a role, and identity leaves a raw, aching absence. Grief has its own grammar. It resists polishing, it requires time, and it needs witnesses who will sit with the pain rather than hurry it away. To grieve in company is to allow others to learn the contours of your suffering. Invite a friend into the shape of your memory. Tell a story about the person you lost. Name the ways their absence rearranges your daily life. In telling, you create a social repository for your grief, and that repository is a place of care. There are embodied practices that help too. Loneliness is not only a cognitive narrative, it is a physiology. The breath tightens, shoulders raise, the face contracts. Practices that return the body to calm. Mindful breathing, slow walking, hands in soil, make vulnerability easier. They reduce the fight or flight background noise so the soft voice of approach can be heard. Eye contact held a fraction longer than usual. A hand on someone's shoulder in consolation. The warmth of shared food. These are simple, embodied signals that say, without a claim, you are seen. Another profound lever is meaning. When connection is thin, life can feel like a string of disconnected moments. Purpose knits moments into a narrative. Engage in activities that carry a meaning beyond the self. A volunteer role that places you in a community of practice. A craft that requires shared apprenticeship. Activism that gathers people around a moral aim. Working alongside others for a common good creates comradeship that social media likes cannot mimic. It builds we in ways that small talk does not. And then there is story, the narrative you tell about loneliness itself. Are you a character stuck in an unredeemable plot? Or are you a person in a book with chapters that change? Narrative therapy suggests that by reframing the story, by noticing the alternatives and exceptions, you can alter the arc. What are the moments in your life where connection surprised you? Where did you find warmth in an unlikely place? By collecting these anomalies, you create counterexamples to the belief that you are destined to be alone. They become lifelines of evidence. Practice invites experiments. Here are a few small rituals you might carry out as a kind of laboratory for belonging. 1. The 3 specific question at the end of conversations. Ask and answer 3 small particulars about your day rather than the default, "How are you?" 2. The week of presence. Commit to 5 short phone calls or in-person check-ins with the same small group of people. 3. The repair sentence. Keep in your pocket a short apology script to use when you hurt someone. These are exercises of attention. They are not cures, but they are ways to train habits that make connection more likely. For those whose loneliness runs deep and persistent, there is wisdom in seeking professional companionship. Psychotherapy and group therapy offer spaces where the patterns of attachment and shame can be traced and transformed with skillful support. These are not admissions of weakness. They are investments in relational health. If loneliness coexists with depressive symptoms, with a sense of hopelessness, or with thoughts of harming yourself, reach out to a clinician or a crisis resource. Help is not only available, it is often life-changing. Finally, hold a paradox. The pursuit of connection requires both initiative and surrender. Initiative asks you to risk small vulnerabilities, to extend invitations, to make repairs. Surrender asks you to accept that not every attempt will be returned, that rejection will sometimes sting, and that your worth is not the ledger on which others balance. Together they form a tempered approach, brave, patient, and kind. As you carry this third reflection forward, look for one place where shame narrows your life. Notice one small prediction you can test this week. Offer one repair where something has been left unsaid. Plant one tiny ritual that invites the same people to cross your path repeatedly. Loneliness is not a mystery to be solved by revelation alone. It is a practice to be learned through habit, courage, and shared attention. The remainder of this narration will continue to trace the mappings of mind, body, culture, and philosophy, and to offer, along the way, further practices that are both humble and profound. There is a quiet currency in the world right now that never makes the evening news: attention. It is parceled out in notifications, auctioned by algorithms, rationed by work schedules, and spent on obligations that often bear no fruit of intimacy. We live in an era when proximity does not equal presence. A crowded subway car can feel lonelier than a remote patch of countryside, because the real economy of belonging is not distance, but the quality of attention we give and receive. When you think of connection as attention invested and returned, loneliness begins to look less like a personal failing and more like an economy with broken markets. This helps explain something counterintuitive: that loneliness can feel most crushing in a world absolutely saturated with signals of other people. The streams of social media, the long lists of contacts, the parade of smiling faces and feeds, they promise a network but deliver snapshots. They satisfy the craving for novelty and status but often starve the body of being seen. An image of a friend's dinner will not hold your trembling after midnight. A text with an emoji cannot shape the contours of your sorrow. What we need for deep belonging is not the illusion of connection but the labor of presence. Hands at work, eyes meeting in the same room, time spent in patterns that permit the slow reveal of human complexity. There is a biology to this. Warm touch and sustained eye contact release chemicals that lower threat and increase the willingness to trust. Oxytocin, sometimes called the bonding hormone, is released in proximity and in acts of caregiving. Cortisol recedes when people are predictably kind. This is not romantic science fiction. It is a physiological scaffolding for community. When our environments are designed to minimize these small biological exchanges, our bodies react as they would to scarcity. We become vigilant. Our minds read the world as less safe. The response is understandable. When safety is uncertain, we protect ourselves by narrowing our window for trusting. That narrowing is experienced as loneliness. Attachment styles, once formed in the nursery or in the rhythms of early caregiving, continue to play out against the current of adulthood. But there is something hopeful in that continuity. These patterns are not immutable laws. They are habits that can be apprenticed in new ways. Think of attachment like a set of muscles. If they have not been exercised in reciprocity, they atrophy. If they are practiced in small, repeated acts of trust and response, they grow stronger. The work of repatterning is often mundane. It is less a dramatic epiphany than 1,000 tiny calibrations, showing up when you said you would, answering a message in a tone of care, even if the content is fleeting, allowing someone to make a small mistake and not converting it into catastrophe. There are practices that build this muscle. One is what I will call, without ceremony, the discipline of noticing. Notice when someone's voice dips, when a hand lingers over a mug, when a laugh is brittle. These are the soft signposts of interior weather. Notice without immediately fixing. Practice the patience of being a witness. Another practice is explicit reciprocity. Make and keep micro-contracts with people. Agree to check in on Thursdays, promise to split household chores, arrange a standing walk with a neighbor. These are not constraints on freedom. They are scaffolds for it, providing the rhythm that permits intimacy to grow without the constant friction of scheduling. We must also reckon with the cultural stories we inherit about independence and self-sufficiency. Many of us were taught to prize autonomy as if it were the end of the moral arc, as if asking for help were a confession of failure. This story is corrosive. It frames vulnerability as breach and invites silence as the only safe posture. Philosophically, we might reframe autonomy not as isolation but as self-rule lived in relation, the capacity to choose companionship and to enter it not from need but from generosity. This is a choice that requires both inner work and social courage. It asks us to believe that being needy is part of being human, not a shameful defect to be hidden. There are social technologies we can use to widen the circle of belonging. Rituals that mark ordinary time, shared breakfasts, neighborhood cleanups, grief circles, apprenticeships where people learn crafts together, are old human technologies for making strangers into neighbors and neighbors into kin. They are not glamorous, but they are sacramental. They turn the mundane into meaning through repetition and shared attention. Imagine workplaces that begin meetings with a brief check-in about how people are doing, schools that build collaborative projects around collective purpose rather than individual competition, neighborhoods that design porches and communal gardens to encourage casual encounters. These are design choices with moral consequences. At the level of the interpersonal, there is a method worth practicing that most of us know abstractly but rarely do in practice: reflective listening. When someone speaks, mirror back not only the content but the feeling. You don't need to have an answer, presence is the answer. When we make a habit of listening for feeling, we become instruments of consolation. It changes the tenor of conversation from performance to meeting. It lowers the stakes of being seen. If you encounter only someone who hears the shape of your pain, the risk of disclosure is smaller. We should also cultivate the small courage of asking for what we need without expecting it to be perfect. Could you sit with me for 20 minutes? Would you be willing to tell me what you heard? These are precise requests. They reduce the fog of guesswork that so often poisons relationships. They are also humble. They ask other people to be present knowing they may fail, and they accept their failure without letting it declare the relationship bankrupt. Loneliness is not merely an absence of people so much as an absence of meaningful shared narrative. Humans live by stories. The meaning we give to events, the plots we inhabit about ourselves, the histories we hold with others. To belong is to belong to a story. That is why shared rituals, communal projects, and joint narratives are so potent. They place individual lives into a larger weave. The question then becomes civic as well as personal. What are the stories our communities tell, and who gets to write into them? When certain groups are narrated as peripheral, loneliness becomes a civic injustice. The antidote is deliberate inclusion. Rites of passage that are accessible, storytelling platforms that amplify diverse voices, public spaces that do not segregate by class or age. Building belonging is not simply compassionate. It is an act of civic engineering. There are also individual experiments you can run that are both brave and practical. Try the one invitation rule. For every social week, extend one invitation you might otherwise not make. To a colleague, an old friend, a neighbor. Make it specific and small. Or practice the 2-minute reveal. In a conversation, offer 2 true minutes about what moved you that week and invite someone else to respond. These practices model vulnerability in calibrated doses. They make the economy of attention more generous and less transactional. Philosophically, there is a paradox worth carrying. Intimacy requires both vulnerability and a relationship to solitude that is not fear-based. To be with others is to have an inner life you can return to when people fail you. There is an ethical richness in cultivating self-containment that is not defensive but replenishing. Practices like reflection, reading, a calendar packed with things that are efficient but not tender. The machinery meant to bring us together sometimes becomes a machine for keeping us apart, because it substitutes immediacy for intimacy and quantity for depth. Think of technology like a landscape. It alters where paths run, which bridges are built, and which meadows we encounter. In some places, it creates beautiful clearings where communities can gather. In others, it lays down highways that speed us past one another in a blur. The design choices embedded in our gadgets and services are not neutral. When attention is engineered to be scarce, when algorithms privilege what maximizes clicks over what nourishes, loneliness is an expected side effect. We can marvel at the cleverness of the tools and still ask the hard question: what does a life look like that uses these tools generously rather than being used by them? There is an ethics here, a practical philosophy of living that asks us to be curators of our own attention and stewards of other people's. It begins with the small act of deciding how much of your waking life you will delegate to the glow of a screen. That decision is not asceticism for its own sake. It is elective care. What if you kept one pocket of time each day sacred? An hour when no devices interrupt. What would the quality of your presence be like if you were not training your reflex to check, to scroll, to compare? These are small experiments in reclaiming the economy of attention. They are not moralistic commands. They are laboratory trials. Try them and see what reality teaches you. Underneath the hour-by-hour choices, there are deeper psychological practices that change the tone of our relations. One is radical curiosity. Not the passing curiosity that schemes for novelty, but a deliberate orientation to learn specific things about another person. We might decide, for instance, to learn one personal fact each week that matters to someone close. Not facts as data, but facts as meaning. What memory shaped them last month? What small fear nudges them awake in the night? What quiet triumph they are embarrassed to admit? Learning such things is an act of rehumanization. It counters the logic of reputation and performance, and in doing so, it invites reciprocity. The surprising thing about this practice is how quickly it discharges loneliness. When someone knows the landscape of your interior, you stop feeling like an unmoored thing. Another practice is the discipline of return. Humans are pattern-seeking animals. We learn to trust by repetition. When you commit to a repair, a check-in, a ritual, and keep it, you signal to nervous brains that you are reliable. Reliability may sound prosaic, but it is the scaffold for trust. Reliability does not require grand sacrifice. It requires consistency. That consistency is sometimes humdrum. Answering a call, bringing soup after a minor surgery, showing up at school plays. Over time, these small, predictable acts weave a net. Loneliness shrinks not because dramatic rescues occur, but because the body learns it lives inside a support system. There is also a philosophical reorientation worth naming: relational personhood. Many modern accounts of the self imagine an autonomous subject whose primary project is to protect itself. Relational philosophies, by contrast, imagine persons as formed in relation, as beings whose identity is woven through ongoing exchange. This is not an erasure of individuality. Rather, it is a reframing of what identity is. If you begin to think of yourself as someone who becomes who you are through encounters with others, the moral grammar of daily life shifts. Asking for help becomes not a failure but a necessary move in the formation of self. Offering help becomes not sacrifice but the act of being fully human. This is a philosophical remedy because it changes the stories we tell about worth and need. At the societal level, the solution must be structural as well as personal. Towns, schools, workplaces, and digital platforms can be redesigned with the explicit aim of fostering belonging. Imagine neighborhoods planned with shared courtyards and community kitchens, workplaces with predictable time allotted for casual conversation, and apps built to encourage depth rather than frictionless consumption. These are design choices we can advocate for and create. They require politics, yes, but they also require imagination, the willingness to see belonging as a public good that deserves investment. We should not overlook the small arts that make belonging possible. Listening with the intention to reflect, asking questions that ask for detail rather than platitude, practicing apology that names harm succinctly and repairs it patiently. We should teach these arts early in schools and families so that emotional literacy becomes as basic as reading. When the next generation grows up with a richer vocabulary for interior life, the culture shifts. What seems like a lofty program is simply the slow accretion of habits that create a new normal. For those who feel stuck, the path back toward connection often requires courage of a particular kind. The courage to be ordinary. We imagine connection must be earned with spectacle or constant charisma. In truth, most human bonds are built on the dull work of ordinary reciprocity. Bring someone coffee, write a note, call to ask about a test, stay for the grocery run. These are small gestures that accumulate into the sense of being woven into a life. Try for a month to pick one ordinary act of care each week and notice the subtle transformation of your social world. There are also deeper practices that cultivate inner resources for relationship. Contemplative attention, art that enlarges empathy, communal rituals of mourning and celebration. Music, story, food, and craft are technologies for bonding that precede talk and explanation. They create shared somatic rhythms that help people feel safe. When words fail, music can hold grief. When shame tightens, a shared ritual of making can loosen it. We are creatures who need more than conversation. We need shared labor and shared beauty. And then there is the question we often avoid. What do we do when loneliness is persistent, when it is braided with depression, or when it feels like a stone in the chest that nothing shifts? There is no shame in seeking guided help. Therapy, peer groups, and supportive communities can provide not only tools but witness. If loneliness coincides with thoughts of harming yourself, seek immediate professional help. Asking for help in such moments is an act of courage that honors the person you want to be. Finally, there is an invitation that is philosophical and practical at once. Cultivate a generosity of imagination. When you meet someone who seems closed, imagine their story rather than assuming their stance is about you. When you are tempted to interpret silence as rejection, remember that the other person might be tired, distracted, or afraid. A generous imagination does not excuse harm. It buffers against reactive withdrawal and opens space for repair. It asks you to entertain multiple hypotheses about human behavior before deciding the meaning of an action. Ask yourself now, what small landscape change could you make this month? Could you reclaim 1 hour of undistracted presence? Could you learn one specific intimacy fact about someone you care for? Could you keep one micro-commitment that proves you can be relied upon? The answers to such questions are not the end of loneliness, but they are the beginning of a practice, a deliberate, embodied, patient apprenticeship in being human with others. If you accept the invitation, belonging becomes less like a prize to be won and more like a craft to be practiced. When you're ready, we will continue the narration and go deeper into the body's wisdom, cultural narratives, and the civic architectures that can heal or harm, and we will keep tracing the small acts that stitch us back together. There is a strange intimacy to the way our bodies remember loneliness long after the mind has consented to a plan. You can make a calendar full of invitations, set reminders to call, join groups, and still find the chest tight at night as if some small muscle had learned to hold its breath. This is because loneliness is embodied. It lives in the tilt of your shoulders, in the quickness of your breath, in the way you scan a room for danger before you allow yourself to soften. The practical consequence of this is powerful. If we want to change how loneliness feels, we must change the body that carries it. And if we want to change how the body feels, we must change the relationships that teach it safety. Think of the nervous system as an old, cautious friend who protects you by anticipating threat. When social cues are ambiguous, a curt message, a canceled plan, a delayed reply, this friend errs toward caution. It raises cortisol, narrows attention, and makes approach riskier. Over time, This physiology learns a prejudiced story about the world, that others are unreliable, that closeness prompts pain. The remedy is neither magical nor solely cognitive. It is incremental resocialization of the body. Repeated, predictable experiences of small kindnesses recalibrate the nervous system. A dozen small evenings where someone shows up, where voices are steady, where touch is safe, can begin to rewrite the nervous script. The work is slow because biology is slow. Trust is not a light switch, but the slow rewiring of a nervous system that once thought the world unsafe. There are practices that help this rewiring. Nothing is more basic and more underrated than rhythm. Shared rhythms, walking at the same pace, chanting in a choir, the cadence of a team working together. Synchronize bodies in ways that conversation cannot alone. Science has a long name for it, but its human face is simple. When bodies move in time, hearts and breathing align, and the sense of belonging grows. That is why groups that make music together, collective work programs, and communal meals are such potent antidotes to loneliness. They require little verbal admission yet produce a deep feltness of being with. We also need to notice how our modern reward systems exploit and hollow our sociality. The intermittent rewards of social media, like a comment, an unexpected notification, operate like slot machines for attention. They trigger bursts of dopamine that feel like connection but are not the same as sustained mutual regard. The result is a confusion of craving for real warmth with the flicker of digital affirmation. The practical solution here is not moralizing technology. It is learning to translate craving into practice. When you notice the itch to check, ask a steady question instead. What small human contact could I pursue right now that has a chance of depth? Make that translation a habit. The itch turned into a phone call, a brief walk with another person, a note written by hand. Over time, the brain learns which habits produce lasting warmth and which produce hollow sparks. There is an ethical and philosophical dimension to tending the body as well. The Stoic idea that one must be self-sufficient can morph into an isolating pride. The existential idea that solitude is inevitable can morph into resignation. Both philosophies offer important truths, but the healing synthesis is a relational humility. The acceptance that we are formed by others and that asking for help is not a moral failure but a recognition of reality. Philosophically, this is a reconception of dignity, not dignity as the ability to withstand alone, but dignity as the capacity to stand in relation without losing yourself. It asks us to be brave enough to be small sometimes, and to see smallness not as lack but as honesty. On the therapeutic level, there are approaches that intentionally retrain both story and system. Some therapies focus on the beliefs you hold about yourself and others, helping you test and revise those beliefs in real life. Others focus on the patterns of interaction, teaching you to ask for what you need, to accept support, and to repair ruptures. Still others center compassion, teaching you to speak to your inner critic with the voice of a concerned friend. None of these are quick fixes. They are skilled apprenticeships in being human with others. If loneliness has become chronic, working with a trained clinician is not a last resort. It is an ethical, practical step toward reconfiguring your relational world. There are also small, disciplined experiments you can run as if you were a gentle scientist of your own life. Keep a trust journal for 30 days and record small instances where closeness was attempted and what happened. Notice patterns. Which kinds of invitations returned warmth, which didn't, and whether your predictions about others were accurate. Run a micro-vulnerability test. In one conversation this week, offer a small, honest statement about your day and invite the other person to respond. Notice what happens to the tone of the exchange. Try a 2-minute presence experiment. Set a timer, put your devices away, and spend 2 minutes making eye contact and listening fully to someone. These tiny experiments build data for hope. They show you where the world is more generous than your fear predicted. There is also a radical generosity required in communities that wish to heal loneliness at scale. That generosity looks like structures that lower the cost of showing up, shared childcare that makes attending community events possible, flexible work schedules that allow presence at family dinners, public spaces designed for casual encounters, local arts programs that invite participation rather than spectatorship. It is not enough to tell individuals to be brave. We must build neighborhoods and institutions that make bravery easier and less costly. This is a political and moral project as much as it is an aesthetic one. The delight of belonging is a commons worth cultivating. Loneliness also reveals the way we narrate ourselves. We cling to stories of failure. I will always be the one left behind. And these stories become self-fulfilling through the choices they encourage. Narrative work invites you to become a skilled editor of the stories you carry. Notice chapters that insist on permanence and seek counter-evidence in your life. Collect moments where someone surprised you with generosity, where an invitation was accepted, where grief was held. Build a dossier of disconfirming evidence against the bleak prophecy. Let that dossier grow until it weighs more heavily in your mind than the fear. And finally, practice gratitude not as a dismissive cheerfulness, but as a careful, specific noticing. Gratitude directed at people. Telling someone why a small act of theirs mattered creates loops of reciprocity and recognition. It rewires both giver and receiver by making visible the often unseen labor of presence. When you turn gratitude outward, you are not hiding pain. You are building scaffolding that helps you and others withstand it. Ask yourself now, what is the smallest bodily practice you could do today that might shift how safe you feel in another's presence? Could you accept a 2-minute walk with a neighbor? Could you sit with a friend without checking your phone? Could you join a group that moves together, a choir, a walking club, a community garden, and simply keep showing up? These are not heroic acts. They are the slow, ordinary disciplines that, over time, retune your nervous system and remake the possibility of trust. Loneliness is patient and persistent, but it is also teachable. It responds to repetition, ritual, and small kindnesses. It can be honored without becoming definitive. If you are willing to be both curious and brave, to test your predictions, to practice presence, to tend the body that houses your longing, the world will offer you 1,000 small opportunities to be known. When you're ready, we'll continue the narration and explore how culture, technology, and civic design either deepen isolation or make intimacy possible. And we will practice more experiments you can try in the days ahead. There is a particular quiet that comes just after dusk when the streetlights flick on and the city exhales. In that hour, loneliness sometimes comes dressed as reflection. Not the sharp, urgent ache that wakes you in the night, but a patient noticing. A ledger of small absences, a tally of conversations that never deepened, of visits postponed until the moment passed. It is easy to treat this quiet as proof that something about you is wrong. It is harder and more honest to treat it as information. A map of what matters to you, a compass pointing toward what your life would look like if it were arranged differently. Loneliness is not a single thing. It moves through us in different costumes. The ache of not being understood, the hollow that follows loss, the slow attrition of friendships that grew thin, the existential solitude that sits beneath even the warmest gatherings. Each costume asks for a different response, but all of them ask, at base, for the same things: to be witnessed, to matter, to have a place where your interior life is legible to another human. The question that keeps returning is simple and relentless. How do we make such places more probable? Begin with attention. Attention is not merely noticing. It is the moral currency of connection. When you give someone your unhurried attention, you are telling them, in the most basic language you have, you matter enough to remove all other things to make room for you. Attention as practice looks like habits. Finishing a meeting and then asking one true question. Setting a ritual where dinner is phone-free. Writing a note that names a single thing you appreciated about someone's presence. These are small economies that compound. They are not dramatic, but they are durable. There is courage in making ordinary things into rituals. Consider the power of thresholds, the small, repeated actions that signal belonging. A weekly shared meal, a regular phone call at the same time, a community cleanup that happens each second Saturday. These are thresholds where continuity happens almost by accident. They take away the need for heroic invitations. They create the conditions under which intimacy can grow slowly and safely. The engineering of belonging is largely an art of thresholds. If our inner lives were gardens, many of us have been walking past neglected plots, mistaking weeds for perennial truths. The work of tending is not glamorous. It is the steady composting of small attentions, the pruning of old hurts, the the planting of gentle inquiries. Part of tending the garden of belonging is refusing the cultural script that says you must perform worth before you are offered care. Practice the opposite. Practice offering care without a full accounting of returns. Not all gestures will be taken. Some will be wasted. That is part of any economy of generosity. The point is to seed more ground than you can tend at once, to risk distribution in the hope that something will root. There are structural moves to make as well, and they are practical. If your social world is thin, widen the circle of shared aims. Work with others on projects that require cooperation but not immediate intimacy: community theater, a neighborhood pantry, a local garden, a volunteer program at a school. Shared purpose does two things. It provides a scaffold for predictable encounters, and it shifts the focus from performance to contribution. When people work together on something that matters, their identities begin to intertwine in healthy ways. We starts to form where none existed. We should also be precise about the practice of asking. Many of us fail at the simplest tactic of human connection because we are vague in our requests. "We should get together sometime" is not an invitation. It is a polite evasion. Replace vagueness with specificity. "Would you like to join me for tea this Saturday at 3? Specific invitations reduce the friction of reciprocation. They ask a clear question and make the other person's response a simple movement rather than a mental project. Over time, practice turns asking into a habit rather than an act of emotional gambling. There is philosophical labor here too. Much of modern loneliness is driven by the story that being worthy of love must be proven by performance. The antidote is a set of counterstories, narratives you must decide to live by. Tell yourself, regularly, the story that vulnerability is not humiliation but a conduit for connection. That your needs are not indictments of your character but information about what helps you function as a human being. That worth is not a commodity to be earned and bartered but a base condition of being. Rewriting these stories matters because narratives shape behavior. A kinder story frees you to take more risks of intimacy. We cannot ignore the body's intelligence. Small material acts, holding someone's hand through a hard moment, bringing soup when a neighbor is ill, showing up for someone when they need physical presence, are not extras. They are primary. These acts signal care to the nervous system in ways words rarely do. Relearning the language of touch and attendance in appropriate, consensual ways is a repair work our culture needs. Embodiment is the grammar of trust. Steady body language, predictable presence, and the soft rhythms of shared time say, "You are safe here," more persuasively than any declaration. At the same time, there is an important discipline of boundaries. Connection cannot flourish if it is confused with absorption. Part of the art of belonging is protecting the space where you can be replenished so you can give without depletion. The language of boundaries is not about pushing others away. It is about preserving the capacity to be generous. Learn to say no where necessary and say yes when you mean it. Those are relational acts as much as statements of preference. Another lever is the cultivation of curiosity. Not idle curiosity that schemes other people like catalogs, but focused curiosity that asks for detail. Ask someone about the precise contours of their week, the tiny triumphs they would not boast about, the small failures they hide. Curiosity, practiced with tenderness, disarms shame. It announces that you are willing to carry the particular of another's life, not just their performance. We must also build repair literacy. People will mess up. We mess up. The difference between relationships that fray and those that hold often comes down to how we mend. Repair is artful simplicity. A clear apology, an admission of harm without diluting the other person's feelings, a concrete gesture to make amends, and a willingness to sit in discomfort while the trust knits back. Repair requires humility and stamina. It is not an easy skill, but it is one of the most valuable. There is a civic question threaded through all of this. Who gets to design the places where we gather? Public spaces, workplaces, schools, these are not neutral containers. When they are arranged to foster incidental encounters and collaborative projects, loneliness recedes. When they are arranged to speed us past one another, loneliness deepens. The politics of belonging is therefore a design project. Advocate for it. Support local arts. Insist on mixed-use neighborhoods. Encourage employers to create time and space for communal life. Small policy choices ripple into the lived texture of days. And finally, keep faith with the small experiments. Loneliness is stubborn because it is embedded in long habits. It yields slowly to repeated practices. One weekly call kept, one invitation extended, one apology made, one repair attempted. Over months and years, those small acts accumulate into a life that feels woven rather than threadbare. It is tempting to look for a single dramatic cure. Move cities, find a soulmate, change jobs. Sometimes those changes help, but more often the durable change is the patient work of small, consistent acts. Before you put this part down, ask yourself 2 questions and hold them like a map rather than a verdict. Which small threshold could I design this month that would make a repeated encounter inevitable? And what one precise invitation could I extend this week that decreases friction and opens the door to reciprocity? These are not tests of worth. They are gentle experiments in manufacture of belonging. Loneliness will visit again. That is the human condition. But each time it comes, you can receive it with a new practice in your pocket. Over time, the practices become habits, the habits become character, and the character becomes a life threaded with human contact that is neither flawless nor permanent, but honest, repaired, and real. If you keep tending the thresholds, asking precise questions, and practicing repair, you will be building not just relationships, but the infrastructure of a life that can hold the weight of being human. There is a hush that lives behind the clamor of our cities, not empty, but expectant, like a theater between acts. If you stand in that hush for a while, you begin to hear the small mechanics of belonging. The soft creak of a porch swing when someone lingers to listen, the distant murmur of a church choir learning a new hymn, the clatter of a communal pot being set down on a stoop. These are the ordinary sounds of a life woven together, hardly glamorous and easily overlooked, but they are the true architecture of being with. In the modern tale we tell ourselves about independence and efficiency, we forget that human life grows not just from heroic gestures, but from the slow, patient layering of small, repeated care. What would a life look like if those ordinary sounds were the highest public value we cultivated? What would it mean to design our days so that the small, sustaining exchanges were inevitable rather than exceptional? Loneliness, at its deepest, is a failure of mutual imagination. A place where I cannot imagine another holding my interior life without turning it into judgment, or where I cannot imagine entering the interior life of another without being bored, burdened, or unsafe. The moral problem here is not merely personal. It is civic. We are addicted to narratives that make belonging an individual project, and in doing so we diminish our capacity to form the institutions that sustain attention and care. There is a quiet politics to this observation. Belonging must be treated as a public good. Schools, workplaces, parks, and digital commons can be built with the explicit purpose of embedding ritual and reciprocity into ordinary routines. A playground is not merely play. It is a social technology. A community kitchen is not merely food. It is a curriculum intending. What small civic acts could we champion where we live that would make those ordinary, sustaining exchanges more likely? If loneliness is a failure of mutual imagination, then one of the most fruitful practices is the disciplined enlargement of imagination. This is not fanciful daydreaming, but a moral exercise of trying on other lives, not to romanticize them, but to make room for their particulars. Imagine asking a neighbor not the generic, "How are you?" but a question that requires a little remembering and a little courage. What small thing this month surprised you with joy? Or imagine a workplace ritual where meetings open with 30 seconds of real human news. One small personal fact shared not to solicit pity, but to situate a person in a story that others can notice and hold. These practices are simple because they are human scale, and they work because they create memory. Belonging is not an event. It is the accumulation of memory. What memories do we want to be living inside? There is also an ethic of repair that must be cultivated, both privately and publicly. Human gatherings always fray. The essential skill is to mend without making the other person the enemy, and without making your own worth contingent on the success of the repair. Repair begins with small sentences that name the harm and take responsibility without capitulation. It continues with the humility to listen, the steadiness to accept a hurt response, and the patience to allow trust to rebuild over time. There is courage in staying in the work of repair even when the immediate result is discomfort. The courage is not heroic. It is stoic and tender. It is the willingness to be the kind of person who tries again. If you imagined a neighborhood where people were easier with apologies and quicker to make the small gestures that show remorse, imagine how that would change the daily texture of life. Art and ritual are freighted with the potential to undo loneliness because they move beyond the pressure of constant disclosure into shared making. A choir does not ask you to narrate your life. It asks you to breathe and sing in time with others. A community mural does not demand intimacy. It asks for the labor of paint and time. These shared labors produce a somatic knowledge of being with that words alone cannot contain. There is a truth here often overlooked. Making something together is a form of knowing one another that is slower and less risky than direct emotional exposure, and it often leads to those exposures naturally. What collective project could you start or join that would put your hands in the same rhythm as others? The role of technology in loneliness is double-edged and must be treated with nuance. Technology can be a bridge, reconnecting old friends, creating distant communities of practice, and enabling softer forms of caregiving. Yet it is also an accelerant for comparison, distraction, and the hollowing of attention. The ethical stance here is not Luddism but stewardship. Decide where you will allow technology to act as servant and where you will keep sacred time free from its reach. Make habit-forming choices explicit. Let certain hours be device-free, choose platforms that encourage depth over noise, and use digital tools to coordinate in-person encounters rather than to replace them. The tiny acts of curation, which notifications you allow, what hours you guard, are not trivial. They change the signal-to-noise ratio of your life and create more space for the kinds of encounters that nourish. There is a psychological humility to practicing connection. We must recognize the limits of our capacities and the idiosyncrasies of others. Not everyone will respond to your vulnerability in the way you hope. Some will withdraw, some will misread, some will respond with warmth. The practice is to keep offering small, calibrated disclosures and to accept the pattern of mixed returns. If you treat every non-return as a definitive judgment on yourself, you will harden. If you treat every return as an obligation to reciprocate perfectly, you will exhaust. The steadier posture is curiosity. Offer, watch, learn. Keep a mental ledger not as an accounting of worth but as a map of probability. This person tends toward care when asked this way. That person shows up when asked in public. This person prefers actions to words. Over time, you build a social map that reduces anxiety and increases the likelihood of meaningful encounters. On a deeper level, there is spiritual and existential work to be done. Loneliness often returns with questions that are metaphysical. What am I for? Who will remember me when I am gone? How does my life fit into a larger narrative? These questions are not mere luxury. They are ways of orienting meaning, practices that broaden perspective, meditative traditions, contemplative reading, service that ties you to larger concerns, can reduce the tyranny of immediate loneliness by situating you in a longer story. This is not a consolation prize. It is a resource. When you tie your actions to a purpose beyond your private circle, you join a lineage of care that has weight and longevity. It helps not only to be loved, it helps to love deliberately in a way that contributes to something enduring. There is a political and moral responsibility embedded in all of this. If you care about loneliness as a social problem, your choices matter. Vote, advocate, volunteer in ways that build the common spaces where belonging can be practiced. Support libraries, parks, community centers, arts funding, and policies that reduce isolation. For instance, family-friendly work practices, affordable housing that promotes mixed neighborhoods, and urban designs that create thresholds for encounter. These are not abstract policy debates. They are the scaffolding of daily life. To participate in shaping them is to take seriously the communal nature of human flourishing. Of course, loneliness will not vanish. It will reappear like weather. Sometimes it will be a storm, sometimes a mist. The aim is not eradication but resilience. Learning how to be present to your own ache without capitulation, to reach for others without desperation, and to build communities that make risk less costly. Cultivate a personal toolkit. Rituals of solitude that replenish you, specific invitations that lower social friction, a small set of people you will check in with on hard days, and a community project that gives your life continuity. Keep adding to this toolkit patiently. It is cumulative work. Finally, bear in mind the strange alchemy of suffering. Pain, when attended to and shared, can become a source of compassion rather than merely a wound. The person who has known a long season of loneliness can, with luck and practice, become the most patient listener, the one who notices the small weather in another's voice, the neighbor who brings soup, the friend who remembers anniversaries of grief. Loneliness can harden into cynicism if it is not tended. It can also melt into care if it is treated with curiosity and courage. Which version will you cultivate? Before you move on, consider this gentle experiment. Pick one recurring, small civic act you can offer this month: to host a neighborhood tea, to volunteer twice at a local shelter, to organize a shared repair afternoon where people bring and fix small household items together. Make it modest and repeatable, not a one-off spectacle. Notice what changes in the fabric of your days when people begin to cross the same threshold with you repeatedly. And ask yourself a quieter question. Which small, true thing are you willing to tell one person this week that might alter the shape of your connection? Keep these questions close. They are not commandments but invitations to practice listening, to practice repair, to practice showing up. When you accept the invitation, belonging begins to be built, not as a miraculous rescue, but as a slow architecture made of many small hands. There are seasons to loneliness, and some of them are wise. They come like winter, a time when the trees let go so that, in a later spring, the green can be truer. This does not sentimentalize suffering. It simply holds a paradox that must be lived. Loneliness can be both wound and tutor, ache and curriculum. In the quiet that follows the ache, when the immediate sting has cooled enough to be examined, there is an opportunity to learn not only how to be with others, but how to be with yourself in ways that change the terms of future relationships. The lesson is practical and moral. Repair begins in the inner room and radiates outward into the places you live. Think of identity as a house with rooms you may or may not have visited. Some rooms are full of childhood furniture. Some are dedicated to work. Some contain grief you have avoided. Loneliness often gathers in an unused parlor, a place in the self where social habits were never taught, or where old betrayals left the curtains drawn. Reopening that room requires permission, steadiness, and small ritual. Permission is a compassionate telling. You may feel small, and that is okay. Steadiness is the willingness to practice the forms of relatedness even when the nervous system resists. Ritual is the repeatable action that marks transition. A weekly letter to an elder, a monthly potluck, the simple choreography of greeting a neighbor by name. Each is a humble technique of habitation, a way to teach your interior world the geography of belonging. There is an ethical architecture embedded in every choice we make about how to live together. When we valorize autonomous achievement above communal responsibility, we produce loneliness as an externality, the cost of a system that prizes productivity over presence. What might it mean to change not only our habits but our shared civic commitments? Imagine policies that treat relationships as worthy of public investment, time banking systems that translate neighborly help into credit, urban designs that prioritize porches and shared courtyards, education that teaches emotional literacy as rigorously as mathematics. These are not utopian fancies but design choices. They ask us to think of belonging as infrastructure that can be built, maintained, and repaired. The question is political as much as personal. What public goods will we fund so that more of us have a place to hang our coats? On the personal scale, there are practices that hold immense power because they are small and repeatable. Begin with a discipline of naming and narrating. When loneliness arrives, give it a descriptive name, not the moralizing slur the inner critic uses, but a precise, non-judgmental label. I notice a tight loneliness about being unseen, or I feel a hollow after a recent argument. Naming reduces shame and converts an overwhelming mood into information you can act on. Then tell a short, true story about it to someone you trust, not asking for a solution but for a witness. Witnessing is a species of repair. It acknowledges and thereby diminishes the sense that you are alone with your inner weather. Practice the art of micro-requests. Most relationships falter not because people are unwilling, but because the cost of asking seems too high or the mechanics of response are foggy. Replace vague declarations with a kind of behavioral clarity. Instead of, "We should hang out sometime," say, "Would you like to meet for coffee on Tuesday at 5? Neighborhood exchanges are not sentimental. They are practical circuits of memory and skill. These circuits transmit repair, perspective, and the small capacities for kindness that create durable communities. At bottom, the philosophical remedy has two corollaries that must be held together. First, accept the fact of separateness. There will always be an irreducible subjective gap between you and any other consciousness. This truth, if fully felt, can lead either to despair or to reverence. Choose reverence. Let the unbridgeable quality of inner life inspire humility and curiosity rather than defeat. Second, cultivate practices that make bridge building habitual. Rituals, repair habits, specificity in asking, generosity without ledger, and shared making. The first gives you perspective, the second gives you tools. What would change if you promised, for one sustained season, to live by a few simple rules? Name the weather of your heart without shame, make one small specific request each week, and do one small thing for another without expectation. What if you committed to a public act in your neighborhood or workplace that invited repeated contact? A monthly repair cafe, a potluck, a reading circle. These acts are not guaranteed to end loneliness. They are guaranteed to change its shape. They will not abolish the ache, but they will create places where the ache can be held rather than magnified. As this penultimate reflection closes, carry with you a small practice. Tonight, name the loneliness you feel in one sentence. Then write down one specific action you can take in the next 48 hours that could invite a human response. A message that names a particular memory you share with someone, an offer of a small, concrete favor, or a request for 20 minutes of presence. Take the smallest brave step you can bear. It is in those tiny, resolute steps, the habit of showing up, the humility of repair, the practice of curiosity, that the architecture of belonging is slowly rebuilt. We arrive at the end of this long conversation as if after a long walk that has wound through streets and rooms we did not at first recognize as our own. There is a certain tenderness in this arrival. Not because everything is solved, the world remains a mixture of mercy and neglect, but because the shape of the problem is now less frightening. Loneliness is no longer a moral verdict pronounced from some austere tribunal. It is a fact of life, a signal, a knot of habit and history that can be patiently unpicked. You have learned that its threads are many: biology and early attachment, culture and architecture, technology and narrative. And you have also learned that its remedy must therefore be many-handed, both private and civic, small and structural, gentle and stubborn. Think of the last 10 parts as a map and a toolkit folded together. The map shows the contours, how the body remembers, how the mind predicts, how institutions shape ordinary days, how stories of worth and shame color interpretation. The toolkit is practical. Micro-vulnerability, ritual and thresholds, curiosity practiced as interrogation of the small facts of another life, repair practiced as disciplined apology and patient listening, the calibration of technology so attention can be given rather than harvested, the cultivation of solitude that replenishes rather than isolates. None of these devices is a panacea on its own. Their power is cumulative and ecological. Small acts become patterns, patterns become habits, habits become the scaffolding for a life in which belonging is more probable. There is a radical humility at the heart of this work. You cannot compel another's feeling. You cannot force trust by will alone. But you can be the kind of person who makes trust easier to give. That is an ethical stance more than a strategy. It means showing up when you said you would, answering even the small messages that signal presence, making specific invitations, and learning to apologize with clarity. It means choosing generosity without immediate accounting, understanding that often the return is slow or it comes in shapes you did not expect. It is not heroic. It is ordinary, and ordinary is where the deep stuff happens. At the same time, do not confuse ordinary practices with smallness of ambition. There is a civic ambition here that asks of us more than private heroics. We must insist that the spaces where life happens, schools, workplaces, neighborhoods, digital platforms, be designed with belonging in mind. The policy decisions about time, space, and design are moral because they structure possibility. Public investment in libraries and parks, work practices that allow for family life, urban design that creates thresholds for encounter, and education that teaches listening as a basic skill are not luxuries. They are necessary infrastructure for social life. If you care about loneliness as a public problem, this is where your private practices can meet public action. Advocate, design, volunteer, vote, and imagine institutions that make small acts of care easier. There is a philosophical radicalism embedded in everything we have spoken of, the refusal of the modern, narrow narrative that equates worth with performance and independence. Replace that with a relational narrative, one where personhood is not a thing that exists prior to relation but something that is continually made in it. This does not erase individuality. It dignifies dependency. Being human means needing and being needed. It means sometimes resting in the refuge of another's steadiness and sometimes being the refuge. If you choose this narrative, your obligations and freedoms reconfigure. Asking for help is not a confession of failure but an honest move in the project of living well together. There is also an existential honesty here. There is always a gap between any two minds, an irreducible separateness. Accepting that truth need not produce despair, can produce reverence. The fact that no one will ever inhabit your inside exactly as you do gives your moments of being understood their preciousness. It sharpens the meaning of attention. If someone takes the risk to cross the gap, to learn the contours of your life, to hold you without reducing you, that is a miracle in miniature. Cultivate gratitude for those small miracles and make them legible. Tell the person why their presence mattered. Write the small thank you. Record the moment in memory so it can be called up in darker hours. Gratitude is not cheap cheerfulness. It is the making visible of the human debt we owe to one another. On the level of practice, return to the experiments. Choose one small, precise invitation per week and make it non-negotiable. Choose one micro-ritual to repeat until it becomes an expectation for the people around you. Practice one short, clear apology when you falter. Try one embodied practice that synchronizes you with others, a walk, a choir, a communal meal, and commit to showing up even when it feels small. Keep a journal of small returns. The unexpected kindness, the conversation that deepened, the repair that worked. Over months, these entries will assemble as evidence against the darkest prophecies your mind sometimes whispers. If the loneliness you know is braided with old wounds, consider professional companionship. Therapy is not an indulgence. It is a form of serious relational training. Sometimes you need a witness who is trained to hold what is difficult and to teach you how to orient toward others without reactivating old defensive maps. Group therapy and peer support communities have a particular power because they provide multiple small mirrors in which you can see recurrent patterns and practice new ones. Joining is an act of courage and a form of reframing. You treat your relational life as worthy of investment. Let us not be sentimental about pain. The ache you feel for being known is not always a noble teacher. Sometimes it is just cruel and grinding. Allow that truth to be present. Allow the full range of feelings, anger, despair, boredom, yearning to be acknowledged. Do not rush to moralize suffering into virtue. Instead, hold it with curiosity and with practices that do not demand immediate transformation. Name the feeling, speak it aloud to a trustworthy other, and do one small practical thing that nudges you toward contact. Sometimes the motion itself is the cure. The act of reaching, even when shaky, changes the interior chemistry. And finally, carry this paradox. To be fully human, you must be both solitary and social. Learn to enjoy your own company without mistaking it for sufficiency, and learn to depend on others without making your whole worth hinge on their responses. The former is a practice of inner hospitality. The latter is a practice of courage and generosity. Let each inform the other. Cultivate a solitude that is replenishing and a social life that is reparable. Make rituals and micro-requests, steward your attention, redesign small thresholds in your life, and advocate for public spaces and policies that make belonging probable. What will you do tomorrow? The question is deceptively simple. You might send one message you have delayed, make one specific invitation, say one apology you have postponed, or choose 1 hour without devices to be present to someone. You might volunteer for a neighborhood project, join a choir, ask a colleague how their week really is, or simply put your phone in another room when you have dinner. None of these acts guarantees salvation. What they do guarantee is the practice of living toward others rather than past them, the slow accumulation of trust, the rewiring of a nervous system that once expected threat and now begins to learn safety. Let the end of this 10-part narration be not a closure but a starting point. You now have a map, and if you have been willing throughout this text to try some tools, the life you want, the kind of belonging you desire, is not a prize waiting beyond a heroic act. It is the result of many small choices repeated generously over time. The architecture of belonging is built hand by hand, threshold by threshold, apology by apology, shared meal by shared meal. Be patient with the slowness. Be stubborn in the small things. Be tender with yourself when attempts fail, and brave enough to try again. In the hush after you read this, breathe and ask, with quiet curiosity, what is the smallest brave thing I can do today to invite another human into my life? Then do that thing. Over the months and years, those small acts add up. They do not remove the fact of separateness, but they change its quality. The gap between two hearts becomes a bridge, sometimes narrow and rickety, sometimes wide and steady, but always crossed by hands.